with war today is that anti-democratic countries, and he didn't have to name China, were waging a new form of warfare that democracies like ours didn't want to admit was warfare, and so didn't respond to like we should.
Today, a new, modernised version of political warfare has emerged. It mixes the old with the new. In a world that's becoming more connected, these activities range from information campaigns, cyber operations and theft of intellectual property to coercion and propaganda, grey zone operations that subvert, erode and undermine, breaking international rules and norms, but ones that, in the eyes of the targeted state, fall short of requiring a war response.
Now, that speech drew heavily on the thinking of Dr. Ross Babbage, former head of strategic analysis in our own Office of National Assessments. Ross Babbage, thank you so much indeed for your time. Is it the case that we're at war with China but just don't know it?
They're talking about them being in a major struggle. Xi Jinping's speeches just for the last couple of months have been emphasising the struggle with the West. And in fact, he's saying to his internal audiences, including senior officials that we monitor, he's saying a lot about prepare for combat. It's serious. And meantime, of course, they're conducting a lot of operations, mainly heavy information operations, cyber operations, espionage operations, and so on against Australia and the West. And we're seeing a lot of evidence of that, and it's really quite serious. The most important, I think, single thing, there's a lot of things that are important, but one of the most important is the information operations, as we say. That is, they're spreading a lot of disinformation. They're very actively trying to influence the media, very actively trying to influence decision makers. And that is, they're trying to change the whole stance of Australia, and in fact other allied countries and other friendly countries, towards China in particular things like changing our attitude towards what's happening in Hong Kong or what's happening in the South China Sea and so on. That's the one thing. But there's also a lot of cyber operations. They've been working very hard to basically steal very large quantities of intellectual property, including highly sensitive information, valuable, but also national security sensitive information, certainly in this country, but also in other countries. They're also working very hard to try and recruit spies and others to be sympathetic to their cause and to actually work for them. And they've been very active actually in trying to coerce or persuade, if you like, a lot of the ethnic Chinese who are in this country to work in cahoots with them towards these ends. And of course, many ethnic Chinese do not want to have anything to do with the Chinese Communist Party. But of course, there are some here who have little choice because they can be threatened with retribution to their families at home, or the possibility of not having a job at the end of their time here if they're coming here as a student and so on.
Yes, with 1.2 million Australians of Chinese background, that is a lot of people for China to be able to work on. That's the issue here. What is China's aim?
What China is trying to do, and this is a long-standing theme in Chinese strategic thought, goes right back literally hundreds of years, is to undermine, in a time that the West calls peace, to undermine the West. To undermine the United States in particular and its close allies, to divide the West and to encourage the Australian public and the Australian decision makers to be much, much more sympathetic to the Chinese position, including their assertive position in territorial expansion in places like the South China Sea and elsewhere, as well as to turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses, the million or so people that the Chinese have locked up in mainly Uyghurs and Kazakhs in what we would call concentration camps, mainly in Western China. A lot of the other things that are really nasty about Chinese society and the way the Communist Party is trying to maintain control there, they don't want that publicised. And so they're taking lots of measures to encourage Australians in a range of key positions to work with him effectively, informally or in other ways, to minimise the pressure on them, to divide the West, and ultimately their goal is to undermine the United States position in the Western Pacific. And in the very long term, in the medium term and long term, they would like to supplant the United States globally.